Perfect. Okay, so we're recording. Good afternoon in Aguascalientes, Mexico, Quito, Ecuador, and Pittsburgh, the United States. Thank you for joining me today as I interview Dr. Guillaume Fontaine and Dr. B. Guy Peters, editors of the Handbook Research Methods and Applications in Comparative Policy Analysis. Dr. Peters is Maurice Falk Professor of Government at University of Pittsburgh in the United States, and Dr. Fontaine is Professor in the Department of Public Affairs at FLACSO, Ecuador. This handbook was recently reviewed in the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, Research and Practice. JCPA is the premier journal for studies of comparative policy analysis and comparative policy studies. As such, we strive to engage with scholarship in the field of the highest caliber. So I wanted to thank you for joining me. And I have a few questions regarding the handbook and your perspective of its contribution to our field. So feel free to go in whichever order you prefer. The first question is, how did the handbook come about? What kind of conversations were you and what were you having that have led to this particular research? What made you do a handbook in methods of comparative policy analysis?
Well, the discussion began actually in Milan at ICPP 5 or ICPP 2, which is now got six years ago, at least, or 8 years ago. But and so Guillaume and I were talking about that we needed a stronger comparative approach in the field. That really what we needed to do, what we should be trying to do in policy studies, policy analysis, is to be more comparative. And so we wanted to find a vehicle for trying to push that agenda. And out of that grew the idea for the handbook.
Excellent, thank you. And so, yes, Guillaume, do you want to add something else? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I totally concur with Guy. I think it was the starting point of our meeting, and that's how we started collaborating, by the way.
Yes, definitely. So before I go into the next question, I have a script, but the next question is, what do we learn with your handbook, and what is the main message? But I would like to phrase it in a different way. I think what I feel pushed you, and you can correct me, to do this handbook as well, is the fact that we have this sort of nebulous idea of comparative public policy, comparative public administration, but comparative policy analysis is, despite the fact that we have JCPA, was still somewhat nebulous, and particularly nebulous in the methods. So I wonder if that was also something that played in your head.
Go ahead, Guillaume. Do you want to start, Guillaume, or shall I?
Okay, well, first, like we said in the intro, there's this methodological turn in policy studies. I think it's a very important point from the handbook to underline the importance of, like scaling up in transparency, and maybe have more rigorous qualitative methods, just like happened in policy science, in political science, generally speaking. And the second point is, I think it's more what Guy is discussing in this intro, like to quit the monopoly of serious methods to the quants. Because there's a kind of a myth about good methods being quantitative. I mean, you're well aware of that because you've been working with mixed methods for a long time. And that's part of the message we wanted to deliver with this handbook. That is, any quantitative method, as good as it is not sufficient. So you always need to go with one or two or more qualitative methods.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I mean,
if I can pick
the
up
World
on that.
Bank has been acknowledging that.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that, I think too often in today, methodology is taught as technique. That if you have the right statistical technique, you can solve your problems.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we were trying to deal with methodology in a broader sense of research design, particularly comparative research design. and really then thinking systematically about which methods, which techniques actually work best in which circumstances. And also trying to think about using multiple techniques, as Guillaume was just saying, to deal with the same problem and to see what sort of different answers one gets when one applies different techniques to try to understand the same problem.
So I wanted to, again, I have a script, but you are giving me a perfect segue. So I think your handbook could very well be the core text that engages with questions of comparative public policy and comparative policy analysis. So is there a specific direction where you think the field is going? And I'm gonna preface that by saying that at FLACSO Mexico, we want to do sort of the Fontaine and Peter's version, you know, for Latin America, for the Spanish-speaking community. Because and I think, and sorry, this is going to be a very long question, but I think the first, because you both have engaged with the issue of comparative policy studies, which is sort of very much along the lines of, you know, Isabel, Isabel, yes, Engeli and Christine Brockmeyer Allison. I mean, that's sort of comparative policy studies, right? You chose to go into policy analysis. So I think the direction in which FLACSO should go is similar to the you know, Engeli and Brockmeyer Allison and then the Fontaine and Peters. Unless you think otherwise. What do you think, right? Like, what is the direction broadly internationally, and then in the Spanish-speaking community? I think, Guillaume, you have a good pulse on the a good finger on the pulse. So anyway, whichever wants to start.
Guy.
Okay. Well, I think to some extent what we were trying to do is, you know, what we said a moment ago was where we think it should be going. That is, trying to use multiple methods to try to understand what's going on in different settings, to understand context. So too often context is written out of our studies of policy. We focus inside the box rather than outside the box. So we need to bring in all those environmental factors, et cetera, into our policy analysis. Okay, secondly, although it has been one of these fads, in practice, people are talking increasingly about using ideas and results from other settings when they're designing their own policies. So again, the evidence-informed policymaking has been a fad. It's an important fad, but if it's not done well, then you leave yourself open to massive mistakes. So I think in terms of practice, what we're trying to do is to help the practitioner as well as the academic understand better how to use comparative evidence and use that then for not just for understanding, but also for application.
Yeah, I can remember the very nice maxim that Guy put in his book on strategies for comparative politics, and it goes like comparison is about maximizing variance, minimizing error, and controlling spurious variables and effects. So if you apply this reasoning, which is basically a quantitative and a statistic reasoning, to multi-methods, then you really get to the point. I think, how do we maximize variance? It's also from questions, from research questions. And how we control for error, it's basically multiplying entries. And this can less and less be done by sole persons. I mean, there's also the myth of the super scholar resolving every problems that comes at mind when he starts to dig deeper and deeper. And I think the current trend is more like collective work. And what we've been seeing also on another project we've been working on, which is about policy design, is that comparative policy is also about team projects and multiple methods team projects. That is, you will need, if you want to work on that, let's talk about, I don't know, energy transition, which used to be a very specialized item, but it's now a very common topic for most sectors of the society. So you will need probably expert engineers and expert economists, but you will also need anthropologists. And you will also work with the sociologists, and specifically from urban sociology. So if you put these persons, these different specialists together, you will necessarily have to do a multi-method design, because you cannot expect, let's say, an urban sociologist to think as an economist. And that's the very story of Smoketown. We were talking about Dreisig in Bobro, and long story short, so we're talking about how to design policies. And I think comparison is about designing policies. They just bring that to the discussion, but that's like 40 years ago. And it's just against the fad, or maybe the dogmas of QCA and econometrics, and now RCD, because I think journals are just giving the tone in that discussion, not necessarily those that are being read by practitioners, but in the academic field, it's just a trend.
Something that I really, yes, go on, Guy.
I was thinking, just to pick up on the point that Guillaume was making there, it's not just multiple methods either, it's multiple theory. So I think too often we go into these questions with a very single, narrow-minded view of what the answer is going to be and what we need to look at. But as you say, you need to bring in anthropological, sociological issues, as well as the economic and political. And we need to get better at doing that than we have been in the past, particularly if we want to really inform practice.
That's actually, you have answered two of my questions, but so, which is really interesting. But so your handbook, in my view, does not privilege quantitative nor qualitative, doesn't necessarily focus on a large number of cases, but sort of tries to cover everything, which I think it's very well done. Do you think that's the general direction of the field, or do you think the field is going to continue to specialize? Because I see a lot of QCA out there, right? Like, people are starting to do QCAs and fuzzy sets, and I'm teaching mixed methods this semester, both at the master's and the PhD level, 2 different groups. And I tell them, don't ever choose a method and then decide on your research question. The problem and the research question should drive the choice of method. So I don't know, I think that's something you do very well. But I want to pick up on this, because I think you are sort of telling us, in a way, and correct me if I'm wrong, that comparative policy analysis needs to be done with multiple methods, with multiple teams. There is no super scholar, like, but it needs to also be attending to multiple theories. And that's where my next question goes, right? Like, where do you think this research is going? What are your next step after this handbook? And you just mentioned something on policy design. So I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more on your future project.
Okay, well, Guillaume, or I'll do it. Well, we are just about to finish another handbook, this one on policy design. And the handbook we're talking about was pretty big, but the one that's coming out is going to be bigger. So it's a look at trying to figure, to deal with how does one design policy, and what do you need to do to design good policy. And a lot of that involves comparison, because again, you're potentially borrowing from other settings, from practice elsewhere. And so design should be in many ways comparative. So the world's a lab, and we can use that lab to give us evidence about designing for our own settings. But again, but also the designs that we're talking about, designing, is multiple theories are involved, multiple broad frameworks for analysis. Everything from sort of hardcore quant type thinking to interpretive political policy analysis, etc. So it's fairly broad, all of which have something to say about policy design.
Yes, and I would add that the most difficult thing that we've found in both handbooks is to have people joining a table to have a discussion, to have a dialogue. Because so many people come at the Congress or at the conference so self-assured and basically interested in only one thing that it's very hard to get them out of the scheme, to change chip. And when we talk with practitioners, it's basically the problem. I mean, that's why probably policy advising is still in crisis. I mean, apart from the legal aspects and probably the economical aspects of quantitative evaluation or impact evaluation. But generally speaking, I can feel a distrust, at least in Latin America, between practitioners, experienced administrative and political leaders, and young scholars graduating from the master's in public policy or even from a PhD in public policy or in public administration or in government. And so I guess the aim of such handbooks is probably to bridge both worlds and to give a chance to these students to find their way of making things easier, or even, I think, making things more efficient. Well, that's basically the policy design turn was about. We didn't want only to explain why policies fail or why they succeed, but we also wanted to make better policies. That's the idea Guys has been publishing for the past 3 or 4 decades. And so the question is how can we do that? And how can we help you do that? And I think that goes both for our students, for our colleagues, of course, well, at least the most clever ones, the more open-minded ones, and for the practitioners that will contract the next generation of policy makers and policy designers.
This is, we're about to wrap up. So I just have 2 questions, and one is where the next gap in the literature is. So you've covered policy design. So what else are we missing? And I'm going to say something. A lot of people think it's implementation. I think so too. But I think we need to talk policy implementation, not as public administration, but as policy study. I mean, because the policy implementation field has, the street level bureaucracies, literature like nailed down, right? So I think we need to go from what you both have said, designing good policy, to implementing good policy. So that's my view, but and then the second one is and this reminds me of an article that you published, Guy, in the JCPA on comparative policy studies, and basically comparative politics, right? Like, think comparatively. And I tell these my students, I taught comparative methods last year at CIDE, a doctoral seminar, and I used a lot of your work, both of your works, for my classes. So do you think we should do that, right? Like, do you think we need a Spanish language, sort of first comparative policy studies, and this is the sequence I'm thinking, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, sort of a book or something on comparative methods, and then comparative policy studies, and then comparative policy analysis before sort of, there's a huge gap in the literature in Spanish on this. So anyway, 2 questions conflated into one, and I apologize. So go in the order, whichever you prefer.
I'll start. I think I would take you up on the implementation argument, but take it one step farther. That is, the other hat I wear, in addition to doing policy work, is governance. So I'm finishing up a book, in addition to the handbook, finishing up a book on governance. And so making the argument that policy is how we govern. So it's not just being implemented, it's essentially fundamental for governing. So if we divorce, put policy over in a little box and think that it's technical and dominated by economists or whatever, we miss the point. So we have to think about public policy then as the means by which we reach collective goals, which is governing. And therefore, it goes even beyond implementation, which is essentially how you put it into practice. And even with implementation and street level bureaucrats, I mean, this fundamentally is about not only about delivering a policy, it's also about essentially how the state works and how the state deals with its citizens. So this is the contact between state and society. So again, it's governing. So I think we've, to some extent, if we go back to Lasswell, a lot of what he was talking about really was governing, and policy is the means. And we've lost some of that in the 60 or so years since he was writing. I think we need to go back to that in policy and to think very strongly about how it fits in an overall governance scheme.
Yeah, I believe the most difficult task is to go back and forth from the specific work of policy implementation, policy agenda setting, and policy evaluation, and so on and so forth, and to the broad picture, which is basically what people are expecting to see, I mean, citizens and governments. Of course, there's this heuristic of the policy cycle, and we won't get rid of it ever. But it's not a problem if we just consider it a heuristic. And basically, the two ideas that we've been talking about for this hour are that we need something much more encompassing, but not less rigorous. That is methods and theories. We need to be able to dialogue and to have theories dialogue, but we need to do that in a transparent way, and we need to be able to replicate. Otherwise, it's just waste of time. And that's basically what we had to resolve in the past 3 decades. I mean, after the Sabatier and Jenkins-Smith critique of the policy cycle, no one has been able to produce such an encompassing framework. And I think policy design is basically the response, the reply to that challenge. But then again, how we operationalize that, it's basically around governance and how we manage, either from government perspectives or from the society perspective, conflicts, innovation, resilience to change and resistance to change, etc. So the point at the core of policy making, whatever you call it, I'd rather call it design, but I know it's not a consensual term, is to compare. And the problem is we do not have a real transparent method of comparison, because there are so many interests at stake and so many different questions at stake that everyone comes with this solution, his or her solution. You were referring to the Angeli and Rothmeyer book. I found half of the book is about QCA, and the philosophy of the way they conceptualize comparison is essentially a QCA philosophy, which is good. I mean, I do not have any problem with that. But then again, I remember one seminar we made at Pittsburgh, and we had this young scholar, a pure quantitativist. No, I don't remember his name, and it doesn't appear in the handbook because it declined the invitation. But he was precisely criticizing very harshly small n comparison for being basically like something like junk science or something very poetic, so to speak. I don't know if you remember a guy.
Oh, I do.
You know who I'm talking about.
I know. I think we probably shouldn't mention names and stories together. So.
It's okay. I think there's, I mean, as long as they're anonymous, I think, but I think it's true. Like there's this sort of very strong focus on wanting to do quantitative. I remember when I saw the work, for example, of Covadonga Meseguer, who does polyphysi diffusion, it's very quantitative, right? And I was like, well, I would love to hear. I mean, I respect her work and I respect any quantitative scholars' work. I do mixed methods, I can run quantitative and qualitative, but it just made me think, wow, we need something more at a finer scale, at a more fine-grained scale. So, which I think your handbook does really well. I mean, it doesn't, diminish quant. It highlights qual. It highlights what I think, and that's sort of the message I would like, watchers of this interview to go away with. Your handbook also speaks to practitioners, which I think it's so important, because I mean, we all want to do, good rigorous research, and that's important, but what about the people who actually are on the field and need to do comparative policy analysis? So I think I use it all the time, and I recommend it to my students all the time and to colleagues as well. So this is sort of the message that I get out of your book. That's sort of the message. I imagine this is part of the message you want to get. So any last words before I have a little signing out message that I want to give to our viewers, but any last words that you would like to provide?
No, I think thanks for the opportunity. That's all I would say.
Thank you for giving me the time. 30 minutes with you both is fantastic, and JCPA viewers and readers will appreciate it. So thank you so much, Dr. Guillaume Fontaine and Dr. Bigay Peters. This interview will be posted on our website, on the website of the JCPA, and circulated through our social networks. You can find us on Twitter at JCPA_ICPA and on Facebook as the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. And thank you again, Guy and Guillaume, for joining me for this interview. It was incredibly insightful. And it was also, as always, a pleasure to see you both.
Thanks a lot.